October 2nd and whew, heat hasn't been turned on yet. No. Thank you for watching my video on whether or not I'm a Christian. If you enjoy my content, go ahead and like down below, share a comment. Okay, no, this is an interesting question, I promise. I've been thinking about this question consciously for about 21 years, and I've been living in Christian cultural soup my whole life, so I've got a lot of thoughts. There are a lot of different ways to approach this topic, like what's in my heart and mind, and what do I believe, and the ways that Christianity does show up in my life. And after I started writing these things down and started really exploring my experiences with and thoughts about this topic, I decided that it was worth sharing because it meant something to me, and I think there are a lot of people who feel a lot of different kinds of ways about this topic. So I'm going to go through this video, which is loosely organized and highly anecdotal, and if at any point you are inspired to share, I hope you will type it up in the comments and let us all know. Part 1 is what I believe. And let's start with the big one. I do not believe in the divinity of Jesus of Nazareth. If you're a Christian, that's pretty fundamental to all the things that come after, because it's kind of the premise of the founding guy. And that's not to say that there aren't Christian atheists out there, people who follow Jesus' teachings but do not believe in his divinity. Those people exist. That's not me. And it's not that I don't think there are good and worthwhile teachings in Christianity, because there absolutely are. It's more that I am not familiar with a lot of them, and so it doesn't really make sense for me to say I follow them when I don't even know them. Actually, for a long time I felt like Christianity was forbidden information, like I wasn't allowed to access it. For example, I had a friend who was teaching a class at a community college, and I was interested in taking it because I thought she was a smart lady and I wanted to learn from her. And when I was looking it up in the course catalog, I saw that it was a Christian studies class, and I said, kind of disappointed, I was like, oh, it's a Jesus class. I felt like I couldn't or shouldn't go, and I kind of wish I had, because she was my friend and because I could have learned something, but it just felt off limits to me as someone who isn't a Christian, right? Because that's the thing. To anybody who's actually Christian, you know, looking at me, it's like, oh, it's a heathen. And I know that reaction because I grew up in the South. And there are a couple of Bible things that I'll quote, but it really depends on context. Like a couple of years ago, I was thinking about the book of Exodus, and I've learned since then that there are multiple versions of this story. So what I'm about to say might not hold true for every version of the Old Testament. I don't know all of the versions. I don't even really know one version, but in the version that I am most familiar with, the God Yahweh has to harden the Pharaoh's heart so that he keeps not letting the Hebrew people go. And because of this, he doesn't really have agency as a character. He just does what God tells him to do, basically. Like he can't grow as a person, he can't make better or more compassionate decisions. That's his role in the story. But what I found interesting is that the God Yahweh is not the only God that the characters in that story would have prayed to, because the Egyptians had their own set of gods, and one of those gods was Anubis, the god of the underworld, who at the end of your life, he would take a feather and your heart and he'd put them on a scale, and if you were a good person, then your heart would be lighter than a feather, and if you were a bad person, he'd eat you. And so the Pharaoh, with his artificially hardened heart, I'm just imagining Anubis taking this thing and dunking it on the scale, and it's like dunk, like it's so absurdly heavy because no human being could ever do or believe something so hard as a God could make their heart be that hard. So I'm imagining Anubis taking in this situation like, I have never seen this one before, calling up Yahweh on the God phone like, what did you do to my boy? At this point, my stepfather turns to my mother and goes, what kind of Sunday school did you send these kids to? And my sibling goes, bold of you to assume. And my mother goes, Unitarian Universalism? And I did go to Sunday school as a kid. I was even in a church play, but I digress. I actually told one of my friends that I was making this video, and he mentioned that I seemed like the kind of person who would read the Bible for like scholarly reasons. And I've tried. I really like to think about big ideas and philosophy, so you might think that I'd be really into theology, like as a concept. And when people give me the curated versions and they're like, this is something that's really interesting, or this part is really thought-provoking, I'm into it. Hence the aforementioned crossover universe. But when it came to sitting down to read the Bible cover to cover, it was kind of boring. Like, I don't even think I got to Cain and Abel, and that's like the second thing to ever happen. The only other bit of independent Bible study that I've done was Googling my own name to see if there were any Chloes in the Bible, and there were. The innkeeper in Corinth, where Paul stayed, was a Chloe. She was a business owner, she was a girl boss, and this is what I assume people mean when they talk about biblical womanhood. Seriously though, my lack of knowledge about Christianity is vast and deep, and sometimes has led to some very funny misgivings. For example, I learned somewhere that Lucifer meant bringer of light, and so I got the devil mixed up with Prometheus, who in ancient Greek mythology brought fire from the gods to the humans, and then he got strung up on a side of a cliff where an eagle came and ate his liver every single day. So I got that mixed up with the devil, thinking that he had taken fire from God, given it to the humans, and that was why he was confined to the underworld. Apparently that's very incorrect. There was also once a Michael who introduced himself like, I'm named after one of the angels, and I was like, aren't there thousands of angels? Like, I don't know all the angels. And he's like, there are 3. And I'm like, who are they? Yeah, no, apparently it's Lucifer, Michael, Gabriel, live and learn. But while my ignorance around Christianity can sometimes lead to very funny results, it's not the reason why I'm not a Christian, right? Like, even if I knew everything there was to know about Christianity, I'd read multiple versions of the Bible, I kept abreast of theologic studies, I attended church, I attended conferences, I would still not be a Christian. And the big difference between Christians and a lot of religious people and me is part 2, prayers, swears, and curses. When I first heard the way that hit my ear, I knew I would have to include it as a section header. Back in 2013, I had a job at a Walgreens near my college. Every once in a while, a customer would chat with me about this or that. Maybe their spouse was shopping, and on this particular day there was this older gentleman who was just hanging out by the service counter, and he was asking me about what I did when I wasn't working, and I told him I was a student, and he said, well, what do you study? I told him that I was an English major, and he lit up. He goes, oh, you've got to read this book series, and he starts telling me about it. And the way that he pitches it to me is, it's if the atheists got what they want, which this book was about Armageddon and the end of the world and God's wrath. And it made me wonder, what does he think atheists are? It seems like in his mind, he can't even fathom of not believing in God. Atheism then is refusing to pray to God instead of, just not believing in God, which I find very interesting. Now, to sort of underline the mistake that he made, let me give you an analogous example. Imagine having a set of curtains that you think looks really good, and a little cat who wants nothing more than to shred them. So you buy the cat toys and catnip and laser pointers, and you spend a lot of time trying to distract the cat away from the curtains. And then that first guy makes a new friend, and he ends up at this new friend's house, and he sees that there are these nice curtains, but there are no cat toys, and there's no laser pointer, and he's like, what, do you want your curtains to get shredded? And the second guy goes, shredded? What do you mean shredded? And the first guy goes, buy your cat. The second guy goes, I don't have a cat. The first guy goes, of course you do, cats are everywhere. The second guy goes, no, I'm not a cat owner. I just don't have a cat. And that's kind of how I felt when this guy was telling me what atheists want, because he thinks that we want the apocalypse, and I'm thinking, I don't even believe in God. A few years ago, I was watching a Vlogbrothers video. It was either one of those reunion videos or it was their podcast, because they were talking with each other. And John mentioned that there was someone or something that he was going to pray for. And Hank said, well, I can't do that, but you are in my thoughts, and I do wish you the best. And John was like, what do you mean you can't pray? Anyone can pray, and you just do it. And Hank explained that, well, if you don't believe, then it's not really prayer, is it? It's kind of just hoping. Like, in order to elevate a hope to a prayer, you actually have to believe that there is somebody listening who will, or at least might, invoke higher power into your words. Like, you're calling on their power to achieve your ends. As I've been thinking about that distinction, hope plus divinity equals prayer, I think that distinction is there in swears as well. Just think about the kind of language we use when we swear. Until like 2 days ago, I thought that saying, I swear by XYZ was just a way of saying something that you cared a lot about in order to show how much you promise. Like, I promise this much, I double dog promise. But just like there's a distinction between hoping and praying, I think that there's also the same distinction between promise and swear. By injecting divinity into your promise, you're saying, if I am lying, or if I don't follow through on this thing I say I'm going to do, then I give permission for God to take from me this thing that I'm swearing by, as if he needed permission to take things from you, bless your heart. But seriously, if you believe and you don't follow through on your swear, there's gonna be hell to pay, literally, and you wouldn't risk that. But for someone like me who doesn't sense any divinity in these words, it hits a little differently. Like, I still follow through on my promises, but a promise is just between two people with no divine mediation. Finally, curses work the same way. Again, think of the language we use when cursing someone. To borrow from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, a plague on both your houses. Mercutio, the guy, can't put a plague on your family. Only God can do that. So much like a prayer, he's invoking God's power to inject his words with more meaning than a person would be able to do. And as a result of this, most of the power comes if you believe. And if you don't believe, then what he's saying is still rude, but it's just rude. It's not an existential threat against the safety and security of your family. Now, between prayers, swears, and curses, religious people hold a lot of vicarious power over the runnings of the universe. Like, sure, God doesn't give you everything you ask for, but prayer works sometimes. Otherwise, people would stop praying. And on some level, I really liked the idea of having a little extra sway over the universe in my back pocket for when I really needed it, even though I didn't believe in any organized religions myself. I actually tried witch magic for a while in case I could harness some of that power I hadn't found in prayers, swears, and curses, but no luck. My thinking, and I don't think I put it in nearly so many words, but my thinking was that some people can invoke deities and other people are more in harmony with environmental magic, and everybody has, you know, just some way to harness their will to the outcome of, I don't know, maybe some people feel it, but I just don't. A very unmagical person. It's like in My Little Pony how some of the ponies have wings and can fly, and then some of them are unicorns and can do magic, and then there are the earth ponies. I'm an earth pony. And don't get me wrong, Applejack is the best pony, but you gotta admit she doesn't have any magic. Which brings us to part 3, my upbringing. All right, so I mentioned earlier that I've been aware of being non-Christian for 21 years now. Like, my family celebrated and still does celebrate Christmas, but it's always more of a Santa Christmas rather than a Jesus Christmas. And even the fact that I'm talking about Christmas rather than Easter says something about how invested I am in the theology. I don't know, I like the lights and the shiny things and the gifts and the family and the marzipan. And when I heard that modern Christmas was an appropriation of pre-Christian solstice holidays, I thought, yeah, I mean, if that was the default, I could get behind that, because for me, the theology doesn't inject it with any extra meaning. For me, Christmas is kind of just like Thanksgiving, but, you know, a month later and with presents and slightly different food and less football and not really very much like Thanksgiving. For me, religiosity cannot make Christmas more special, because the things that make it special to me are things like making it through another year with most, if not everyone, still with you, and giving them tokens of your love and appreciation, and just being there with them. So for me, you could do that on any cold winter day, and you could call it whatever you wanted, because that's not the part that matters. It's a very nihilistic Christmas where you have to inject your own meaning into something that is innately meaningless. But it would be silly to say that there was no religion at all. I mean, atheist Christmas is still Christmas. Like, for example, earlier I said that I was in a Christmas play that was foreshadowing, and I don't really remember much about this because I was pretty little when this happened, but I do remember this one moment in rehearsal when one of the kids, like littler than me kids, was playing one of the sheep. They left the stage, I don't know, to get a juice box, I don't know. Now, I was cast as a shepherd. I've been told what a shepherd was, that you keep the flock together. So I took my crook, my prop crook, and I hooked this kid. I didn't learn much about the reason for the season, but I sure did learn how not to break immersion in a scene. Now, we stopped going to church around the time that my sibling and I started school, but one time I was at some friend's house, and that sounds grammatically incorrect, but they were sisters. I was at some friend's house for a sleepover, and their mom said a prayer right before we went to sleep, and I was like, what was that? And if I remember correctly, it was that super simple one. Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep, and if I die before I awake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. And there's actually an amazing joke version of this one called the student's prayer. Now I lay me down to rest, I pray I pass tomorrow's test, and if I die before I wake, that's one less test I have to take. But I digress. I was so surprised, and my friends were like, but don't you pray? And I was like, I don't know how. And my friends helped me put together a little prayer book, and I stuck with it for a day or two, but I guess it just didn't click for me. But I did ask my mom why we didn't go to church when it seemed like most people did. And she was like, if you want to go to church, I'll take you to church. And we went, and I was bored, and we didn't go again. Kind of like my experience reading the Bible, actually. And then for various things over the years, churches would be a convenient meeting place. Like Girl Scouts would meet in the church, or a theater would meet in the church, or manners lessons would happen in the church. And as far as I know, I don't think that they were sponsored by or informed by the church. I think that it was kind of just a space. What's weird though, when I think about it, is that all that time in churches doesn't make me less uneasy when I'm in churches now. When I go into a church now, I'm like, am I supposed to be here? And especially the smaller ones that focus on community, because I don't know anybody in this room and they don't know me, and that means that they know I'm not really supposed to be there. It's actually kind of embarrassing to show up. But on the flip side, I love big churches like Duke Chapel or the National Cathedral. They feel like they're for show, more museum than they are space for religious contemplation. Hi guys, this is Editing Chloe here. I realized as I was going through the footage that I didn't actually stop to talk about why I love the National Cathedral as much as I do. As a blanket statement, I love any kind of big, impressive architecture, and throughout Christian history, because Christianity is a faith that spreads through conversions in frontier areas, Christian missionaries, and then once they got established, the Christian church would try to impress people that this is the house of God. One of the ways that they would do this was by building the biggest, baddest churches. It would be the biggest building in town. It would be the biggest building anybody would see in their life. And in a lot of places in Europe, you have these hundreds of years old churches, thousands of years old churches, and each one was specific to its local village. It's hyper localized in a way that a lot of Americans don't really think about or comprehend. So when I visit different European countries and I tour their churches, I noticed these differences, but it didn't really mean much to me because I didn't know the local history in the way that a local would know the local history. Even if a tour guide was telling me, oh, and this is important because of this, I'd be like, mm-hmm. But when I moved to DC and toured the National Cathedral, there was so much local stuff that I actually knew for the first time that I'd ever been on one of these tours. The most famous of these things would be the gargoyle in the shape of Darth Vader's helmet. I mean, what's more American than that? Now, my favorite gargoyle is actually a different little guy. Look at this guy's feet. He's got a little monkey head and an alligator tail. This guy is so weird, and I love him. You know, if you get a chance to come to DC, I highly recommend doing the National Cathedral. You know, it's a little ways off the mall, but it's not too far from the zoo, so maybe do those two in one day. And, you know, in a way, I feel like this ability to engage positively with certain aspects of Christianity actually sets me apart from part 4 other atheists. When I was in my junior year of college, which coincidentally had an affiliation with the United Church of Christ, which does not matter except that I'm on the topic. While I was in my junior year of college, there was a new club called SANE. I don't remember what it stood for, but basically there was a new atheist club to join, and I thought, I'm an atheist. Perfect! I have never in my life been in a room with such weird energy. Like, when I showed up, I thought we'd talk about anything but religion. But the conversation that everybody seemed to want to have was all about their parents' religion and overcoming religion and how religion shaped them. And I asked, guys, is this an atheist club or not? As a lifelong atheist with a few loose ties to Christianity, I didn't come to an atheist club to talk about religion. You know, I wanted to talk about whatever was popular in 2014, like Marvel or something. And one of the guys pointed out that for a lot of them, that was the only space they had to be atheist. That was the only space. They had to carve it out for themselves, and if they wanted to talk about their shared trauma, that's what they were going to talk about. Now, that sounds less to me like atheism than, I don't know, like a support group. And I don't need a support group for my atheism. I was raised atheist. If anything, my dad was disappointed not in the fact that I had joined an atheist club, but in the fact that later that year I made a new friend who happened to be Christian who tried to convert me. You know, and I tried too. I went to her Bible club, I engaged in good faith with the passages that she selected for me, and I pushed back a little bit, but if you know me in real life, you know that that's just me testing an idea to make sure that it's airtight. And I engaged, but ultimately it came down to the fact that my love, and this is pre-gay marriage, that my love wasn't good enough. And I put it to her like this: I understand that human love comes second to love of God, but why is it that my love the only love I can feel isn't good enough. And she didn't know. And she was such a sweetheart. She actually gave me a Bible and she said, you know, see what works for you. There might be something in here that still resonates with you, but that she understood that there were a lot of sects that weren't going to mesh well for me. Hi guys, it's Editing Chloe again, just wanting to interject a little bit here. Interestingly enough, one of the churches that is pretty cool with the whole being gay thing is Unitarian Universalism. Especially the one I went to. See, I ended up doing a little extra research on this church and I found that it had a long history of activism. Originally this church was Presbyterian, but in the 1950s they tried to racially integrate and they got pushback from the higher ups. So they spent 40 years just being completely unaffiliated, but then the congregation dwindled down to 100 elderly people and they were like, we're never going to be able to keep this going if we only have 100 people who come regularly. So in the 1990s, they became affiliated with Unitarian Universalism, so they would have that larger umbrella while still being true to the values of the community. And the reason why I bring this up here is because the minister that they hired when they switched to Unitarian Universalism, and the one that I knew as a little kid who attended that church, was himself gay. And again, I was a little kid, I didn't know him well, and I certainly didn't know anything about his personal life, but I found out later that he had grown up Baptist and he wanted to be a minister. That was his career goal, but when he figured out that he was gay, he figured he wouldn't be able to do that. And he became very disillusioned with the whole institution until finding Unitarian Universalism, and then things kind of came together for him. But I really respect the fact that he wouldn't reject a whole part of himself, you know, who you love, it's a pretty big part of yourself, for the sake of a career. And it's just fortunate that it all came together like that. And that was such a big thing for me. I felt for so long like the church was the enemy. Like I didn't see or hear or understand that there were any denominations that didn't just straight up hate queer people. Chick-fil-A is the enemy. Hobby Lobby is the enemy. The Mormon Church is the enemy. There was no Christian left, nothing nearly as powerful as the Christian right. Like, who talks about the Christian left? If they support gay and trans people, they often do it silently. And quiet support doesn't exactly win rights. And then there's the whole matter of tithing. You know, as a rule, the more fundamentalist your church gets, the more you tithe. So on one extreme you have like the Mormon Church, which is a full tithe before taxes. And then on the other extreme, basically the more liberal you get, the less as a percentage of the person's income people tend to donate to the church. And in a capitalist democracy, what this ends up meaning is that the more fundamentalist the church, the more political power they have. Now, am I saying that Unitarian Universalism is the problem? No. It's just that there's a very different dynamic at play, and I don't hear people talking about it that much, so I just thought I'd interject it here. The first time I met a gay Christian of my own generation was a coworker at the bookshop that I used to work at. She was a lesbian, well, is a lesbian, and her mom's a minister. I don't know what denomination, but they're Christians. And that lady had fewer hang-ups than I did. So just let that sink in. And I was actually standing next to her when I was going through that course catalog to see what our friend was teaching. And when I saw that it was a religious studies class, I was a little disappointed by that, and I said, oh, it's a Jesus class. Well, to me, it felt off limits, but to her, it felt intrinsic. And she was like, excuse me? And I backpedaled and I tried to explain myself, but I think about that a lot. I think about how dismissive I was about something that I could never seem to understand or believe in or access. And I said to her on a different day, but around the same time, that it felt to me like I was missing something. Like there was some level of sophistication of thought or something that I must be missing if I can't connect to theology the way so many other people can and do and find meaning from. And I don't think she really understood where I was coming from, because for her, she's been doing this her whole life. It's instinctual, it's intrinsic, and for me it feels foreign, and I can't really relate to any religious concepts on any level beyond the philosophical. So I'm very different from a lot of atheists. At least for the really vocal atheists, I find that they often grow up in the church and have a lot of pushing back that they feel like they need to do. Like they need to seek out like-minded peers and talk about their atheism or make it a political statement. And I simply don't relate to that. I'm fascinated by it, ironically in the same way that I'm fascinated by Christians. It's just so different from how I see and experience the world. I actually had a little phase when I watched a lot of Mr. Repsian and Jacqueline Glenn, and then more recently I watched a lot of Jimmy Snow. And again, all these people are atheists, but in that lapsed Christian way that I don't really relate with. For them, anti-theism, and specifically anti-Christianity, is a righteous cause against a constant threat. Like, even at my angriest about the church opposing LGBT rights, I was never compelled to make a YouTube video about it. Until now. Do you want to hear about the time a Calvinist told me I was predetermined to go to hell and used that to justify treating me as less than human? And I thought atheists had no morals. But seriously, the big difference between them and me is that while I see the church as a political threat, they see it as a much more personal threat against, for example, queer children who will grow up mentally ill and depressed and maybe even suicidal because they internalized all of the horrible things that they heard about themselves from the people in their lives who have authority over things like morality and the right way to live your life. It's like they see the church first and foremost as an entity that will consume you. On the contrary, as an outsider, sometimes I get curious, I'll check it out and see what appeals to me, and usually it's not too much, but there are things that I like. Part 5, things I like about Christianity. If you hung out with me at all, then you know I love quoting the Bible out of context. For example, at some point, I started doing this thing, like if I was talking with my sibling about our dad, I would call him our Father who art in Hillsborough. That is next tier absurdity. How can that not put a smile on your face? Or saying amen to things that don't need or deserve an amen. I do say bless a lot, but I think the way I use it tends to be more bless your heart, which if you're not from the South, that translates to you are unforgivably dumb. So if I say bless, chances are I'm just saying the situation is dumb. Actually, there are also situations where I use it to say like, you're amazing, or thank you so much, which I should probably just say you're amazing and thank you so much. Because like, here's the thing. I'm not blessing anything. It's like I said in the prayer, swears, and curses section, I just don't have the conviction to put any kind of divine meaning or power behind my words. It's a thing I can't do, even if I wanted to. So in a way, my quoting Bible things out of context is kind of like that joke when non-athletes, atheists if you will go, woo, sport ball! I don't think it's called sport ball, and I know it's not called sport ball, but I'm drawing attention to the fact that I'm not generally a sport person, and like I'll try to root for the right kid. Like I know that our Father does not refer to someone's literal daddy, and even the fact that I would call him my literal daddy is part of the same kind of humor. Like no one my age says daddy unless they're in a dungeon, so the fact that I'd clarify is downright surreal. So I'm very much not making fun of Christianity, but rather having fun the way that I have fun with everything, which is to play with words and ideas. And I mentioned earlier that I like the art and architecture, and I actually have a few Christian things in my house. So for this section, I've gathered up all of the Christian stuff I have, and let's go through them. So first up, I have my cross. This is the big one. I bought this fall at the Renaissance Fair to finish my costume, and I'll put up a picture of my costume. And while I was at the Renaissance Fair, I actually saw a lot more gemstones and New Age kind of theologic symbology. And the contrast between the gemstones and then I was buying this for my costume is just like so many people today believe in the innate powers of your gemstones to bring you certain kinds of luck and different fortunes, and you combine them this way and that way in order to change your fates. This, for a lot of people, this is their gemstones. This is a meaningful channel between them and the divine. And I just had this moment, you know, in my LARPy little costume, it kind of meant something to me. And then next up, I have my little reindeer candle holders. Not much to say about these guys, I just like them. And then I've got my bowl of ornaments, which I never put away. I don't like putting things away. This just lives on my dresser all year round. All right, number 4. I'm starting to reach a little bit here, but I think this counts. This picture of Edward Elric is one of my favorite works of art. Full stop. Look at the expression on his face. Consider the fact that he has a metal wing. I mean, what is the point of that? When I saw this, I had to have it. I just love it so much. And then my 5th and final Christian thing that I have in my house and love is this Christmas cactus, which, because I live in a very small apartment, also doubles as my Christmas tree. I put a little bauble around it, and that's it. It's all my stuff. And then the rest of my art doesn't really nod towards any religion, I don't think. Which I actually had been meaning to pick up some art of like Achilles, so maybe this is my push to do that. And then one more thing I do like about Christianity is Lent. And I don't do it every year. You could say I don't do it religiously, but the couple times I have done it, I gave up something that I'd been fixating on, you know, sugar, negative self-talk. Because here's the thing, every moment that you spend putting yourself down is a moment that you spend obsessed with yourself. Nobody needs that. But to be clear, it's a personal thing, not something that I'm doing to thank Jesus for spending 40 days in the desert. Like, for me, there's nothing magical about the number 40. If it was fewer days or more days, it would be the same to me. But again, I live in Christian cultural soup, so I may as well use the infrastructure since it's there, right? You know, it's like looking something up on Amazon only to call your local bookstore and order from them. Funny thing about growing up in the South surrounded by real Christians is that I felt like the most atheist that ever atheisted. But then I moved to DC and my perspective changed. Part 6. Leaving the South. So the other day I was hanging out with my friend who's Jewish, and I was telling that story about the guy from Walgreens who thought that atheist meant somebody who wants the rapture to come. And I finished the story basically saying that it's kind of nice living in DC because people don't just like assume that I'm some kind of a Christian. Like walking around the South, for people who didn't know me, I probably assume I'm some kind of Protestant, like most people were. It's just a baseline assumption. I mean, if someone did know me, then they know I'm a heathen. But it's the South, so if they didn't know me, you know, we get to talking, then they'd, you know, mention something biblical as some cultural touchstone, and it would go over my head, or I'd say the wrong thing, and then they'd be like, oh, I've been talking to a godless infidel for the last 10 minutes. And I've gotten a lot less of that in DC, which I generally think is pretty nice. So I tell this story, and my friend thought that I was upset about being taken for a different kind of Christian than the kind of Christian that I am, which I find interesting for 2 reasons. First, because it's a weirdly impossible thing to do. Like, you can't guess the wrong denomination for me for the same reason that you can't guess the right ones, because like I don't belong to a church. And then second, because this statement shows that they are a person in DC mistaking me for some kind of a Christian. So there's a flip side to being in a less religious area. When I'm in the South and surrounded by real Christians, then I'm a godless atheist who only celebrates Christmas for secular reasons like family and togetherness. But as my friend pointed out, when people say Merry Christmas to me, they are correct. The first time I put a word on my loose religious acculturation, if you will, was a time when I was hanging out with a Lebanese friend, and she thought that it was kind of weird that Americans don't have a religion, like atheists wouldn't have a religion. Like, even if you don't follow the religion, in her mind, you still have the religion. You still are of that faith. In the same way that you would have a race or an ethnicity, even if you weren't like culturally connected to it. So when talking with her, I said, well, I guess in that case I would be Unitarian, and she had never heard of that denomination. So I used a phrase that I picked up years prior in a Buddhist temple, that Unitarians are like lapsed Catholics. Apparently there's like a pipeline that goes from Catholic to Unitarian. Now the corollary of that, because again I was in a Buddhist temple, is he goes, and Buddhists, at least Western Buddhists, this wouldn't be true for anywhere else, but Buddhists are lapsed Unitarians. Just the chillest people, being extremely chilly. And actually, out of all of the religious spaces that I've ever been in as an adult, that Korean Buddhist temple in North Carolina was the most welcoming, and I didn't feel out of place, and everything was very accessible and chill. It was really helpful for me in a time when I just needed a quiet space, and then I got busy and then I moved away. Anyway, that's the story of how I became a Christian. I didn't change my attitude towards divinity. I didn't change my beliefs at all. I didn't find Jesus in a time of need. You know, it was as simple as push comes to shove, what would you be? And the answer was Unitarian, I guess. Doesn't mean I know anything about Unitarianism other than that thing that Buddhist guy told me. You know, I'm not part of a congregation, I don't go to church. It's more an acknowledgement of the fact that I didn't grow up in a vacuum, and that I have been impacted by and influenced by a sort of nebulous hegemonic Christianity. And then I started thinking about what my religious sensibilities might look like if I was in a non-Christian country. Hi guys, it's Editing Chloe yet again. So if I was going to be living in a non-Christian country, whether or not I would celebrate Christmas or travel to celebrate Christmas would depend on a lot of things. The most direct analog that I have for this experience of usually celebrating a holiday and then being in a country that doesn't celebrate that holiday was when I studied abroad in England, where they don't celebrate American Thanksgiving, obviously. And as November arrived, a lot of my friends asked if I would be going home for Thanksgiving, because that's a big holiday. Americans usually get together for Thanksgiving. But with circumstances the way they were, I didn't really feel the need to travel. First off, it's a short trip, 3 months, and I'd be home for Christmas anyway. And plus, it's a long, expensive international flight that would leave me jet lagged in the middle of a week that I didn't have off, and then I have to dig myself out of the hole. It would be a whole thing, and it just wasn't really worth it for me. So if it's something like that, no, I'm not going to travel. But I can also see where if one of a few different circumstances had been different, I would have made a different choice. One is, if I had family with me, we would do the holiday even if people around us weren't celebrating that holiday. The second one is if I was there long term and I wouldn't have another opportunity to conveniently see my family for another big celebration that was coming up anyway, because I'm a religious fanatic. Coincidentally, I'm actually spending this coming Christmas with some atheist family in a non-Christian country, and I still don't believe in the divinity of Jesus of Nazareth. In conclusion, what I'm getting at is that context is important. To a certain extent, what you believe and even what you know only accounts for so much of the equation. Like, I think anybody would acknowledge that there is a world of difference between me and the people who've tried to convert me, or between me and the guy who thinks that atheists want to bring around the apocalypse. Actually, I think it's funny that non-Christians think I'm a Christian, whereas real Christians are like, I find your lack of faith disturbing. And the more I think about it, the more I realize that there's no way for me to identify that would please everybody. Third generation atheist with Christian undertones is a mouthful. Editing Chloe is here one last time. The original script ended with me saying that I'm a third generation atheist with Christian undertones. And while that is true, it doesn't feel like how I identify. What it feels like is how I would identify myself to someone else. One of the things, I guess, about being a third generation atheist is that I don't really think about this stuff very often, which is unlike people who come from a religious household, whether or not they currently practice. You know, people who were Christians and are now lapsed and now they're atheists, they had to work through a lot of stuff. I didn't. So when I was working on this video, I found myself thinking through things that I'd never really bothered to think through before, and doing research that I had never, I had to look up little things. Like, for example, I had no idea why Lent was 40 days when it ends on Easter, but Easter is 3 days after the Judgment Day, right? He dies on the cross and is resurrected 3 days later, so where's the 40 days coming from? Well, that's a completely different thing. That's the 40 days in the desert. So I'm learning all of these things. Like, I didn't know before what the difference between a sect and a denomination was. Actually, for a second, I honestly thought that sect might not even be a Christian term. I thought that sect might only refer to Judaism, and I was like, okay, I really hope I didn't get that wrong, so I looked that up, and I had to look up the difference between a pastor and a minister, because I also didn't know the difference there. And it's all these little things where I just never been very careful in my thought before, where I just glossed over things or assumed one thing or another. And I guess it was just never really relevant in my life, or came up often enough, or in a situation where I would need to think about it or notice, or call someone by the right title or whatever. And then I also learned some local history, which I thought was kind of cool, and kind of contextualized a few things there too. So yeah, I just wanted to put this little note in the end to sort of show what kind of work was being done in the scripting and researching and thinking behind this video, because it is so personal in so many ways, but it's also been a research journey for me as well. And I think that might be it. All my thoughts about my own religious identity. Don't forget to light a fire in my comments section and subscribe for more.